The chandeliers of Ashworth Hall blazed with 1,000 candles, their light catching on crystal glasses and silver platters, casting dancing shadows across damask walls hung with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who had never known such abundance. The November air outside pressed cold against windowpanes, but within the dining room, warmth and laughter mingled with the scent of roasted pheasant and Burgundy wine, creating an atmosphere of such relentless gaiety that it seemed almost desperate in its brightness. 32 guests sat along the mahogany table that stretched the length of the room, their voices rising and falling in practiced conversation, the ladies' jewels glittering like captured starlight against silk gowns of emerald and sapphire and wine-dark crimson. At the far end of this glittering assembly, separated from the nearest conversational cluster by 3 empty chairs that might as well have been a vast ocean, sat Lady Beatrice Hartwell, widow these 3 years past, her mourning period long concluded, yet her isolation somehow still absolute. She wore dove-grey silk, a concession to half-mourning that she no longer strictly required, but which served as armor against expectation, and her dark hair was dressed simply without the elaborate curls and ornaments favored by the other ladies present. Her plate held portions she had not requested but which had been served to her nonetheless. Food she moved about with her fork in a performance of eating, while her gaze remained fixed on the middle distance, trained through years of such evenings to appear pleasantly occupied while being utterly alone. She had learned not to attempt conversation with those seated nearest, for they invariably found reasons to turn away, drawn into discussions with partners on their other side, leaving her suspended in a peculiar social limbo where she was present yet invisible, acknowledged yet excluded. From her exile, she observed the table's social geography with the practiced eye of one who has studied her own exclusion, noting how certain guests clustered around Lady Pemberton's wit, how others leaned toward Lord Ashworth's political discourse, how the younger ladies giggled behind fans at some shared secret. And then her gaze found him, the Duke of Thornfield, Lord Adrian Blackwood, seated at what might be considered the place of honor near their host, yet somehow equally isolated, despite the pressed proximity of admirers on either side. He was recently returned from abroad, she knew, though the precise reasons for his extended absence remained subject to speculation and rumor. His dark evening clothes seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it, and his expression held a quality of careful blankness that she recognized immediately, for she wore the same mask herself. While others at the table performed engagement, enthusiasm, and delight in company, the Duke sat with the particular stillness of someone enduring rather than enjoying, responding when directly addressed but initiating nothing, his long fingers turning the stem of his wineglass in slow, absent rotation. Their eyes met across the expanse of silver and crystal, 2 islands recognizing each other across a glittering sea, and in that brief moment of connection, Beatrice felt something shift in her chest, a recognition both unsettling and strangely comforting. Here, she thought, was another soul acquainted with the particular loneliness of crowded rooms. The marriage had been arranged when Beatrice was 19, a practical matter negotiated between her father and Baron Hartwell, a gentleman of 63 years whose first wife had died a decade previous, leaving him childless and in want of an heir he had little hope of producing, but whose estate required the respectability of matrimony. She had not protested the arrangement, for she understood that her father's fortunes had declined, and that her own prospects, being neither a beauty nor particularly accomplished beyond her reading, were limited to such practical alliances. The wedding had been a quiet affair, conducted in the chapel of the Baron's country estate with few witnesses, and the marriage itself had been mercifully brief, for the Baron's health, already precarious, had failed entirely within 8 months of their union. He had been kind to her in his distant way, treating her more as a companion than a wife, spending his evenings in his library while she spent hers in the drawing-room, their lives running parallel but rarely intersecting. When he died peacefully in his sleep one March morning, Beatrice had felt genuine sorrow for the loss of a decent man, but she could not claim the crushing grief expected of a devoted wife, and this lack became her first crime in society's eyes. The second crime was the inheritance itself, for the Baron had left her well provided for, his estate passing to a distant cousin, but a generous portion settled upon her for life, ensuring her independence and comfort. The timing, whispered the drawing-rooms and parlors of neighboring estates, was remarkably convenient. A young woman married to an old man, widowed within a year, financially secure, without the burden of actually having to be a wife for any length of time. No one said directly that she had married for money, or that she had perhaps hastened the Baron's demise through some subtle means, but the suggestions hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp, but impossible to escape. Now, 3 years later, seated at yet another dinner party at the Wentworth estate, Beatrice occupied her familiar position at the table's forgotten end, watching the candlelight play across faces animated by wine and gossip. The Wentworths had invited her out of obligation, for she was still technically part of their social sphere, and to exclude her entirely would be too obvious a cut. But they had placed her where she could do no harm to the evening's atmosphere, and tucked away like a piece of furniture one cannot quite bring oneself to discard. She noticed the Duke of Thornfield again, seated across and several places down, his attention fixed on his plate rather than on Lady Wentworth's animated discussion of her daughter's upcoming presentation at court. While others leaned into conversation, creating islands of intimacy along the table's length, the Duke maintained a careful distance, responding when addressed with brevity that bordered on coldness, never encouraging further discourse. Beatrice watched as Lady Sarah Pemberton attempted to engage him in discussion of his travels abroad, her smile brittle with determination, only to be met with responses so minimal they could not sustain conversation. When the Duke's gaze lifted and found hers across the table, there was that same flash of recognition she had felt at Ashworth Hall, a moment where two people accustomed to performing invisibility suddenly saw each other with perfect clarity. His eyes held hers for 3 heartbeats before both looked away, but something had been acknowledged in that brief connection, a mutual understanding that neither was truly part of the glittering world surrounding them, and that they were both merely enduring until the evening's expected performance could conclude, and they could retreat once more into their separate solitudes. 3 weeks passed in the quiet rhythm of country winter, days marked by frost on window panes and early darkness that sent Beatrice to her solitary fireside with books that had become her most faithful companions, and it was during one of these expeditions to replenish her reading that she encountered the Duke of Thornfield in the village library, a modest establishment housed in the old rectory building, where dust motes danced in slanted light, and the smell of aging paper mingled with beeswax and leather. She had not expected to find anyone there on a Thursday afternoon, when most of the county's gentry would be paying calls or preparing for the evening's social obligations, and she certainly had not expected to round the corner of the history section to discover Lord Adrian Blackwood, standing before the shelves with a volume open in his hands, being so absorbed in its contents that he did not immediately notice her presence. Beatrice froze, her own book selection forgotten, torn between retreating before he saw her and the strange reluctance to leave this quiet space where, for once, she had felt at ease. The decision was taken from her when he looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers with that same flash of recognition she had felt across dinner tables, and for a moment neither spoke, the silence between them filled with the particular awkwardness of two people who have acknowledged each other's isolation but have not yet determined what, if anything, that acknowledgement might mean. "Lady Hartwell," he said finally, his voice lower than she had expected, roughened perhaps by disuse in casual conversation, and he closed the book in his hands with careful precision, as though the interruption had broken some spell he was reluctant to lose. "Your Grace," she replied, executing a small curtsy that felt absurd in this intimate space, among shelves that cared nothing for titles or social position, and she saw something flicker in his expression, something that might have been amusement or might have been shared recognition of the ridiculousness of formal address in a dusty library where they were the only souls present. "I did not mean to disturb your reading," she added, already preparing to retreat, to surrender this sanctuary as she had surrendered so many others. But he raised one hand slightly, a gesture that stopped her without commanding. "You have disturbed nothing," he said, and then, after a pause that suggested he was choosing his words with unusual care, "I confess I am curious what draws you to the history section when the novels are housed in the next room, for most ladies of my acquaintance prefer romances to accounts of ancient civilizations." There was no mockery in his tone, only genuine inquiry, and Beatrice felt something unexpected unfurl in her chest, a small spark of defiance, or perhaps simply honesty. Most gentlemen of my acquaintance prefer to assume they know what ladies read without troubling to ask, she replied, her voice carrying an edge of wit she had learned to suppress in drawing rooms, but which felt permissible here, in this space between social performances. The Duke's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something that might have been approval, and he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the hit. "A fair observation," he said, and then, gesturing to the shelves around them, "What is your preference, then, if not the romances they expect?" She moved closer, her fingers trailing along leather spines as she considered how much truth to offer this man, who was still essentially a stranger, despite their shared recognition of isolation. "I prefer histories because they are honest about human nature," she said finally. "Novels promise happy endings and transformations of character that rarely occur in life, but histories show us that people have always been precisely as complicated, as flawed, as capable of both nobility and pettiness as they are now, and there is comfort in knowing that we are not unique in our struggles." She had not meant to reveal so much, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks, certain she had exposed herself as peculiar or overly serious. But when she glanced at the Duke, she found him watching her with an intensity that was not judgment, but rather a kind of hungry attention, as though she had offered him water after a long drought. "Yes," he said simply, the single word carrying weight far beyond its brevity, and in that moment Beatrice understood that he, too, had been performing for so long that genuine conversation had become a rare and precious thing, and this brief exchange among dusty books had unsettled them both in ways neither quite knew how to name. The invitation to Ashworth Hall arrived on a morning when frost still clung to the window panes, the familiar cream-coloured card bearing Lady Ashworth's flowing script, and Beatrice felt the customary dread settle in her stomach as she read the date and time, knowing that another evening of isolation awaited her at that grand table, where she had first truly seen the Duke and understood they were kindred in their exile. She dressed with particular care that evening, choosing a gown of deep emerald that had been her one concession to colour in a wardrobe otherwise dominated by the greys and lavenders of extended mourning, telling herself that her choice had nothing to do with the possibility of seeing Lord Adrian Blackwood again, though she knew this for the lie it was. The journey to Ashworth Hall took her through familiar countryside, now stripped bare by winter's advance, trees reduced to skeletal silhouettes against a sky heavy with clouds that promised snow, and when she arrived and was ushered into the drawing-room where guests assembled before dinner, she noted immediately that the Duke stood near the windows, his posture speaking of barely contained desire to escape through the very glass he faced. Lady Ashworth fluttered among her guests with practiced grace, her voice carrying across the room as she discussed the evening's arrangements, and Beatrice watched with detached interest as the hostess consulted a small card bearing the seating plan, her expression shifting from certainty to confusion as she glanced toward the Duke, who had turned from the window and was speaking to her in tones too low for others to hear. Whatever request he made caused Lady Ashworth's eyebrows to rise slightly, but she nodded with the kind of indulgent smile one reserves for dukes, whose eccentricities one cannot afford to question, and she made several small marks on her card before tucking it away and announcing that dinner was served. The procession into the dining room followed the usual order of precedence, and Beatrice took her expected place near the end of the long mahogany table, preparing herself for an evening of pretending interest in whatever conversation her immediate neighbours might offer. But when she looked up from arranging her napkin, she found that the landscape of the table had shifted in some subtle but significant way. The Duke sat not at his customary position near the host but several places down, and Beatrice herself had been moved from the very end to a position that, while still not central, had shortened the distance between them by 3 chairs, a change small enough that most guests would not register it as deliberate, but large enough that she felt the shift like a physical sensation, as though the air between them had become charged with awareness. Throughout the meal, she maintained her usual composure, responding to Lord Pemberton's discussion of his hunting plans with appropriate murmurs and listening to Mrs. Alderton's complaints about her daughter's governess with every appearance of attention, but her true awareness resided always in the space where the Duke sat. Close enough now that she could observe the movements of his hands as he handled silverware with precise economy, close enough to notice when he reached for the salt cellar and passed it in her direction, without her having asked, the small crystal vessel appearing beside her plate as though he had anticipated her need before she herself had recognized it. Later, when her wineglass stood empty and conversation had drawn the attention of the servants elsewhere, she found it quietly refilled, and glancing sideways, she caught the briefest glimpse of the Duke, returning the decanter to its place, his actions so subtle that no one else at the table would have marked them. But she knew, and he knew that she knew. And in this silent exchange of small courtesies, something was acknowledged between them that had no name yet, but which hummed beneath the surface of the evening, like a note too low to hear, but strong enough to feel in one's bones. The rain began as Beatrice emerged from the village church, where she had been paying her respects at her late husband's memorial plaque, a duty she performed monthly, more from obligation than sentiment, and within moments the gentle mist had transformed into a proper downpour that sent her hurrying toward the shelter of the church portico, where she stood watching water cascade from the eaves in silvery sheets that turned the churchyard, and into a blur of grey and green. She had not brought her carriage, having chosen to walk the mile from her cottage on what had been a deceptively pleasant morning, and she was calculating whether her cloak would provide sufficient protection for the journey home when the sound of horses and wheels on wet gravel announced the arrival of a carriage, black lacquered and bearing a ducal crest that she recognized even through the rain-distorted air. The door opened before the vehicle had fully stopped, and the Duke of Thornfield emerged with an umbrella already raised, his movements swift and purposeful as he crossed the short distance to where she stood, sheltered beneath the stone archway. "Lady Hartwell," he said, and she noticed that rain had already darkened his coat shoulders, despite the umbrella's protection. "You cannot mean to walk home in this weather?" It was not quite a question, and Beatrice felt the automatic urge to refuse, to insist on her independence, to avoid placing herself in a situation of such intimacy as sharing a carriage with a gentleman would create, but something in his expression, a kind of quiet certainty that her refusal would be both foolish and unnecessary, made her hesitate. And in that moment of hesitation he extended his hand toward her, the umbrella tilting to better shield them both, and she found herself accepting both the hand and the unspoken offer it represented. The interior of the carriage smelled of leather and something faintly spiced, perhaps his cologne or simply the scent that clung to well-made things kept in careful order, and as they settled onto opposite seats and the vehicle began its gentle rocking motion, Beatrice became acutely aware of the smallness of the space, the way their knees nearly touched when the carriage swayed, the sound of rain drumming on the roof, creating a peculiar intimacy that made the outside world feel very far away. For several minutes neither spoke, and Beatrice watched water stream down the windows, distorting the passing landscape into impressionistic blurs of color. But then the Duke's voice, low and thoughtful, broke the silence. "Do you find it exhausting?" he asked. "The constant performance that our positions require, the necessity of being always observed, always judged, never simply permitted to exist without commentary." She turned from the window to find him watching her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but instead felt like recognition, as though he already knew her answer but needed to hear her speak it aloud. "Every moment," she admitted, the truth emerging more easily in this rain-enclosed space than it ever had in drawing rooms or across dinner tables. "I sometimes think I have forgotten who I am beneath all the roles I play, the grieving widow, the suspected fortune hunter, the woman who must always prove she deserves even the smallest kindness." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face, and she saw in them a reflection of her own weariness, her own longing for authenticity in a world that rewarded only careful pretense. "I left England 5 years ago," he said, each word chosen with deliberate care, "not because I desired to see the world or pursue adventures abroad, but because I could no longer bear the weight of whispers that followed me after a broken engagement, after accusations I could neither prove false nor entirely defend against, and I discovered that exile, while lonely, was at least honest in its isolation." Beatrice felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that went deeper than shared circumstance, and she leaned forward slightly, drawn by the rare gift of his vulnerability. "What brought you back?" she asked. If exile offered such honest isolation, the ghost of a smile touched his lips, though it carried more sadness than humor. "I realized that hiding from judgment is simply another kind of performance," he said, and I found I was tired of running from shadows that would follow me regardless of geography. But returning has proven more difficult than I anticipated, for society has long memories and little forgiveness. The carriage turned onto the lane leading to her cottage, and Beatrice felt time compressing. The awareness that this moment of unexpected intimacy would soon end, making her bold in ways she rarely permitted herself. "They whisper that I married an old man for his money and hastened his death through neglect or worse," she said, the words bitter on her tongue but necessary to speak. "And no amount of decorum or perfect behavior will ever fully erase that suspicion, and I confess there are days when I wonder why I continue trying to prove my innocence to people who have already decided my guilt." Adrian's hand moved as though he might reach for hers, then stopped, the propriety reasserting itself even in this private space, but his eyes held hers with fierce attention, "Because surrendering to their judgment would be allowing them to define who you are," he said. "And I suspect, Lady Hartwell, that you are far more than they imagine, far more complex and courageous than their small narratives can contain." The carriage stopped before her cottage, rain still falling steadily, and Beatrice knew she should thank him and depart, should return to her solitary existence and pretend this conversation had been merely pleasant rather than transformative. But she found herself unable to move, held in place by the weight of understanding that had passed between them, and the recognition that they had both been performing solitude for so long that this brief moment of genuine connection felt almost painful in its intensity. And when she finally did step down from the carriage, aided by his steady hand, she carried with her the knowledge that something had fundamentally shifted, that the distance between isolation and connection might be smaller than she had believed, and that perhaps, just perhaps, she was not quite as alone as she had thought. Autumn arrived with the slow certainty of seasons changing, leaves transmuting from green to gold and crimson, and the air acquiring that particular crispness that spoke of time passing and the year turning toward its darker half. And Beatrice found herself standing at her cottage window one morning, watching the postman's approach with the familiar mixture of hope and dread that accompanied the arrival of correspondence. The cream-colored envelope he delivered bore an unfamiliar seal, not the usual crests of the local hostesses who sent her invitations more from obligation than desire. And when she broke the wax and unfolded the heavy paper, she found herself reading words that made her heart accelerate in a rhythm that felt both thrilling and terrifying. The Duke of Thornfield requested the honor of her presence at an intimate gathering at his estate, Thornfield Manor, the following Saturday evening, a dinner for a select number of guests to mark the harvest season, and the wording struck her as peculiar in its informality, lacking the stilted formality of most such invitations, as though the writer had labored to convey genuine welcome rather than mere social obligation. She read the invitation 3 times, searching for hidden meanings or implications she might have missed, her mind cataloguing all the reasons she should decline, chief among them the memory of too many dinners where she had sat in isolation while conversation flowed around her like water around a stone. But there was something in the phrasing, in the careful selection of words, that suggested this evening might offer something different, though she could not name precisely what that difference might be. For 2 days the invitation sat on her writing desk, unanswered, while Beatrice wrestled with competing impulses, the desire to protect herself from further disappointment, warring with a nascent hope that perhaps, after their conversation in the rain-enclosed carriage, after the small courtesies at Lady Ashworth's table, something had shifted in the landscape of her isolation. She thought of the Duke's eyes when he had spoken of exile and honest loneliness, the way his voice had carried the weight of genuine understanding rather than mere sympathy, and she remembered how, for the first time in years, she had felt truly seen rather than merely observed and judged. On the 3rd morning, she rose early and penned her acceptance before she could reconsider, her hand trembling slightly as she sealed the envelope and gave it to her maid for posting, and in the days that followed, she found herself alternating between anticipation and a kind of anxious dread, wondering what she had committed herself to, whether she had misread the invitation's warmth, and would find herself once again relegated to the margins of someone else's gathering. The evening arrived cool and clear, the sky deepening to twilight as her carriage made its way along the tree-lined drive to Thornfield Manor, and Beatrice pressed her gloved hand against her stomach, trying to calm the nervous flutter that had taken up residence there. telling herself that whatever awaited her beyond those imposing doors, she had survived worse, had endured 3 years of society's suspicion and judgment, and could surely manage one more dinner party, though even as she formed this thought, she knew that this evening felt different, weighted with possibility and risk in equal measure. And when the footman handed her down from the carriage, and she saw candlelight glowing warm in the manor's windows, she took a deep breath and stepped forward, choosing hope over fear and connection over the safety of isolation. Though her heart hammered against her ribs and her hands clutched her reticule with perhaps more force than necessary, and she crossed the threshold into whatever transformation awaited her with trembling courage and a whispered prayer that this time, perhaps this time, she might find herself welcomed rather than merely tolerated. The butler led Beatrice through corridors warmed by candlelight and the glow of carefully tended fires, the manor's interior revealing itself as less austere than she had imagined, possessing instead a kind of understated elegance that spoke of taste rather than ostentation. And when she entered the drawing room where the other guests had already assembled, her practiced eye immediately counted the gathering and felt her breath catch in her throat at the realization that only 8 people stood scattered about the room in small conversational clusters, an intimate number that made the usual strategies of disappearing into crowds impossible, and she was still absorbing this fact when the Duke materialized at her side, his appearance so swift and purposeful that she understood he had been watching for her arrival, waiting to perform this particular courtesy, and the warmth in his greeting, the way he said her name as though it carried weight and meaning, sent a flush of awareness through her that she hoped did not show on her face. He introduced her to the other guests with a deliberateness that felt choreographed yet sincere, his hand at her elbow guiding her through the room, and she noted with growing wonder that these were not the usual suspects of their social circle, not the gossip-hungry matrons or pompous gentlemen who populated most gatherings, but rather a curated selection of more thoughtful individuals, a scholarly baronet and his wife who collected rare manuscripts, a widowed countess known for her patronage of artists, a retired military officer whose conversation tended toward philosophy rather than politics, and their spouses or companions, all of whom greeted her with genuine courtesy rather than the brittle politeness that usually masked judgment. When dinner was announced and they processed into the dining room, Beatrice braced herself for the familiar humiliation of being directed to some distant chair, but instead she felt the Duke's hand steady at her back as he guided her to the seat directly beside his own at the head of the table, and the gesture, so public and unmistakable in its meaning, sent visible ripples through the small assembly, eyebrows rising fractionally, glances being exchanged, the unspoken but universally understood message being transmitted that the Duke of Thornfield had chosen to honor this particular guest with placement that suggested regard bordering on preference. Throughout the meal he engaged her in conversation with an attentiveness that could not be mistaken for mere politeness, asking her opinions on topics ranging from the merits of various agricultural improvements to her thoughts on a recently published novel, and when she offered her perspectives, carefully at first and then with growing confidence as she realized he genuinely wanted to hear them, he listened with focused attention that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that her words carried value beyond their social utility. And the other guests, observing this dynamic, could not maintain their polite distance, but were drawn gradually into acknowledging her presence, directing questions to her, including her in the broader conversation, until she found herself participating in the kind of genuine exchange she had almost forgotten was possible. The elderly countess, seated across from Beatrice, mentioned a mutual acquaintance, and when Beatrice responded with an observation that was both charitable and perceptive, the older woman's eyes lit with recognition and approval, and Beatrice felt something crack inside her, the ice that had encased her heart for 3 years, beginning to splinter under the warmth of being seen as something other than an object of suspicion. And when the Duke refilled her wine glass himself, rather than waiting for the footman, when he laughed genuinely at something witty, she said, when he turned to her repeatedly throughout the evening, as though her presence beside him was not obligation but choice, she felt the careful walls she had built around herself beginning to crumble, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. And by the time the dessert course arrived, she found herself engaged in animated discussion with the baronet's wife about Italian poetry, while the Duke watched with an expression she could not quite read, but that made her pulse quicken, and she understood with crystal clarity that this evening, this carefully orchestrated gathering, was not accident but intention, not kindness but declaration, and that the Duke had just announced to his select circle of acquaintances that Lady Beatrice Hartwell deserved not merely tolerance but regard, and the question that burned in her mind as the evening drew toward its close was not whether society would follow his lead, though that mattered, but rather what she would do with this unexpected gift of recognition, whether she possessed the courage to step out of her protective isolation and risk the vulnerability that genuine connection would require. In the week following the dinner at Thornfield Manor, Beatrice discovered that the landscape of her social existence had shifted in ways both subtle and unmistakable, the first evidence arriving in the form of an invitation from Lady Pemberton, a hostess known for her exacting standards and carefully curated guest lists, who had never before deemed Beatrice worthy of inclusion in her more intimate gatherings. And when Beatrice unfolded the cream-colored card and read the request for her presence at a small musical evening, she felt a complicated tangle of emotions that defied simple categorization, something that was part gratification and part suspicion, wondering whether this sudden expansion of social opportunity represented genuine acceptance or merely strategic positioning by hostesses who had noted the Duke's public demonstration of regard and were now hedging their social bets. Accordingly, the invitations continued to arrive with increasing frequency, her morning correspondence transforming from the sparse trickle she had grown accustomed to into a steady stream of requests for her company, and she attended these events with careful attention to the small but significant changes in how she was received, noting that hostesses now greeted her with warmth that seemed almost genuine, that seating arrangements no longer relegated her to the table's forgotten corners, but placed her among guests of consequence, that conversations included her rather than flowing around her as though she were invisible. Yet even as she experienced this shift, she found herself analyzing each gesture for authenticity, questioning whether the smiles were real or merely painted on faces that had learned to follow the Duke's lead, and this constant scrutiny exhausted her in ways that the old isolation had not, because at least in her previous state she had known exactly where she stood, had understood the rules of her exclusion, whereas now she existed in uncertain territory, unable to distinguish between genuine acceptance and performance, and the not knowing gnawed at her during sleepless nights, when she lay awake, wondering whether she had simply traded one form of loneliness for another, the isolation of rejection, for the perhaps more painful isolation of being valued not for herself, but for her association with someone society deemed worthy. At Lady Ashworth's next dinner, Beatrice found herself seated in the middle of the table, with the vicar's scholarly wife on one side and a visiting baronet on the other, both of whom engaged her in pleasant conversation about topics ranging from recent botanical discoveries to the merits of various charitable endeavors, and she participated with appropriate warmth, while simultaneously conducting an internal interrogation of their motives, wondering whether these same people would speak to her with such consideration if the Duke had not first demonstrated his regard. And this dual consciousness, this simultaneous experience of the moment and analysis of its authenticity, created a kind of emotional vertigo that left her feeling unmoored and uncertain, grateful for the improvement in her circumstances, yet resentful of the implication that her worth derived not from any inherent qualities she possessed, but from reflected glory borrowed from someone else's approval, and as the evening progressed, she felt pride warring with gratitude inside her chest, the part of her that had survived 3 years of society's judgment, wanting to reject these belated courtesies as too little too late, while another part, the part that had been desperately lonely for so long, wanted simply to accept whatever connection was offered without interrogating its source too closely, and she left the dinner that night feeling more confused than comforted, wondering whether she had the strength to navigate this new social landscape, or whether she should retreat back into the familiar safety of her isolation, where at least she had known herself to be genuine even if society had found her wanting. And the question that haunted her, as her carriage carried her home through darkness, was whether she could bear to be someone's charity project, even if that someone was the Duke of Thornfield, even if his regard had begun to crack open something in her heart that she had thought permanently sealed, because accepting kindness always meant accepting vulnerability, and Beatrice was no longer certain she possessed the courage required for either. The confrontation came during Lady Ashworth's garden party 3 weeks later, when Beatrice found herself wandering the sculpted paths between rose bushes, still clinging to their late autumn blooms, seeking temporary escape from the drawing room, where too many eyes had tracked her movements with that new speculative interest she had come to dread. And she turned a corner in the maze of hedges, only to find the Duke standing alone by a fountain, his posture suggesting he too had sought solitude. And when he looked up and their eyes met, something in her chest finally broke open. All the questions and doubts and careful analysis she had been conducting for weeks suddenly demanding release, and before she could stop herself the words were tumbling out, asking him why he had done it, why he had singled her out for his regard, whether she was merely a project for his conscience or perhaps an act of rebellion against society's expectations, and she heard the edge in her own voice, sharp with something between anger and fear, asking whether he pitied her, whether he saw her as some wounded creature requiring rescue, and she watched his expression shift from surprise to something more complex, something that looked like pain mingled with understanding, and he stepped toward her slowly, as though approaching something fragile that might shatter at sudden movement. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an intensity that made her breath catch, telling her that he recognized in her a kindred spirit, someone who understood what it meant to carry the weight of others' perceptions like stones in one's pockets, slowly drowning under the accumulation of judgment and whispers and sidelong glances. And then he began to speak about himself, words coming faster as though a dam had broken, revealing that he had fled England, not for adventure or business as society supposed, but because he could not bear the suffocation of scandal, a broken engagement to the daughter of an earl, and accusations of impropriety that were never proven but never forgotten, whispers that followed him through ballrooms like persistent ghosts until he chose exile over endless defense of his character, and he had stayed away for 5 years, believing distance would erase the stain, only to discover upon his return that society possessed a longer memory than he had hoped, that people smiled to his face while wondering behind his back whether the accusations had held truth, and he saw in Beatrice someone who carried similar burdens, who understood that once society decided to suspect you, the verdict became permanent, regardless of evidence or innocence, and he told her with devastating honesty that he had not approached her out of pity but recognition, not charity, but the desperate hope of finding someone who would not require him to pretend that judgment did not wound, who would understand that beneath his title and wealth and position, he was simply a man who had grown unutterably weary of performing acceptability for people whose good opinion he no longer valued. And as Beatrice listened to this confession, she felt something fundamental shift inside her. The defensive walls she had built crumbling as she recognized in his words an echo of her own isolation, and she found herself telling him that she had been afraid, terrified actually, that his regard would prove conditional or temporary, that she would discover herself to be merely a convenient companion in his boredom rather than someone valued for her actual self. And he reached for her hand then, a gesture so gentle and deliberate that she did not pull away, and he said with quiet certainty that she had misunderstood everything, if she believed his attention was anything less than genuine appreciation for a woman whose intelligence and resilience had reminded him that there were people in the world worth knowing, worth risking further judgment to stand beside, and in that moment, surrounded by the dying roses and the fountain's gentle music, Beatrice felt the last of her suspicion dissolve, replaced by something far more dangerous than doubt, the beginning of hope that perhaps she had found not a benefactor but an equal, not rescue but partnership, and the recognition terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. The deepening of their connection occurred not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through the quiet accumulation of small moments that built upon one another, like stones forming a foundation, the first of these coming on a frost-touched morning when Beatrice walked the grounds of her modest estate and discovered the Duke standing at the edge of her property where it bordered the public road, and when she approached with surprise, he explained somewhat awkwardly that he had formed the habit of walking early when the world was still and found the paths near her home particularly pleasant, and though neither acknowledged the obvious truth that his estate lay in the opposite direction entirely, they fell into step together as though it were the most natural thing in the world. their conversation beginning with observations about the changing season and the way morning light transformed familiar landscapes into something strange and beautiful, then gradually deepening into discussions of philosophy and literature, and Beatrice discovered that Adrian possessed not merely education, but genuine intellectual curiosity, that he read not to appear cultured, but because ideas fascinated him, and he in turn found in her a mind that challenged his assumptions and offered perspectives he had not considered, their debates ranging from the ethics of land management to the merits of various poets, to questions about duty and desire, and the price of conforming to society's expectations, and these morning walks became a ritual neither named but both anticipated, meeting as though by accident at the border between their properties 3 or 4 times each week, and gradually Beatrice began to trust that his interest was genuine rather than performative, that he valued her thoughts rather than merely tolerating them, and she noticed how he listened when she spoke, not with the polite patience men often employed with women, but with active engagement, sometimes disagreeing with her conclusions, but always respecting the reasoning that led her there, and Adrian found himself hoping that she was beginning to see him as more than his title, that when she looked at him she perceived not the Duke of Thornfield with all his wealth and position, but simply Adrian, a man who had been lonely for so long he had almost forgotten what genuine connection felt like, and their conversations expanded beyond their morning walks, to include exchanges of books with notes written in the margins, his observations on passages that had moved him, and her responses that revealed the workings of her remarkable mind. And once he sent her a volume of poetry with a particular verse marked as words about finding unexpected grace in barren landscapes, and she understood the metaphor he was offering, that they had each been barren landscapes before this unlikely friendship, and she sent back a different collection with her own marked passage about the courage required to trust after betrayal, and these small gestures of intellectual and emotional intimacy built between them something that transcended the social performances they were both so weary of maintaining, creating a space where they could exist as themselves rather than as the roles society had assigned them. And Beatrice felt the rigid defenses she had constructed beginning to soften, not crumbling all at once but gradually becoming permeable, letting him in by degrees, and Adrian recognized this trust for the precious gift it was and handled it with corresponding care, never pushing for more than she was ready to offer, content to let their connection develop at whatever pace felt safe to her, and in this patient accumulation of shared moments they were building something neither dared yet name, but both had begun to depend upon. A partnership of minds and hearts that existed apart from society's judgment, a refuge they had created together in the quiet hours when the world was not watching. The crisis arrived on a cold November evening at Lord Pemberton's estate, where the dining room blazed with candlelight that did nothing to warm the chill. Beatrice felt settle over her skin when she heard Mrs. Georgiana Worthington's voice cut through a lull in conversation, the woman's tone carrying that particular sweetness that always preceded poison, remarking to her companion in a volume clearly calculated to reach Beatrice's ears that it must be wonderfully convenient to be widowed so young and so wealthy, with all the freedoms of marriage but none of its burdens, and Beatrice felt every muscle in her body tense as the familiar shame washed over her, that old instinct to shrink and endure and pretend she had not heard, and she was aware of Adrian going rigid beside her. He saw from the corner of her eye how his hand tightened on his wine-glass until his knuckles whitened, and she knew he was preparing to respond, to defend her honor as he had done in smaller ways these past weeks, but something in her rebelled against needing defense, against allowing this woman to reduce her once again to a helpless target. And before Adrian could speak, Beatrice turned with deliberate grace toward Mrs. Worthington, her voice emerging clear and steady as she observed that convenience was indeed a curious word to describe 3 years of mourning a man she had cared for despite their brief acquaintance, 3 years of bearing the weight of others' suspicions while managing an estate and honoring her late husband's memory through charitable works that perhaps Mrs. Worthington had not noticed since they did not provide occasions for gossip, and she continued, with devastating precision, to note that freedom was also an interesting characterization of widowhood, as she had discovered that society granted far more freedom to married women of certain moral flexibility than to widows who committed no sin beyond surviving their husbands, and the entire table had gone silent now, every guest frozen in fascinated horror at this breach of polite pretense, and Beatrice met Mrs. Worthington's gaze directly as she concluded that if the lady found her circumstances so enviable, perhaps she should consider them more carefully, as they included not only wealth but also the daily experience of being suspected, diminished, and discussed by people who knew nothing of her actual character or choices, and she delivered this response with such controlled grace, such perfect composure, that it was impossible to characterize her words as an outburst or loss of control. And Mrs. Worthington's face had gone pale, then red, her mouth opening and closing without sound, defeated by her own malice turned back upon her, and in the terrible silence that followed, Lord Pemberton cleared his throat and changed the subject with desperate determination, and Beatrice returned her attention to her plate with hands that trembled only slightly, her heart racing with the audacity of what she had just done, and she felt, rather than saw, Adrian's reaction beside her. The way he had gone utterly still, and when she finally dared glance at him, she found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch, something beyond admiration or approval, something that looked like revelation, like a man seeing clearly for the first time what had been before him all along. And later, when the ladies withdrew, and she stood by the drawing-room window trying to calm her racing pulse, he found her there and spoke quietly of how magnificent she had been, how he had been prepared to defend her, but recognized now that she required not rescue but partnership, not protection but equal standing, and in that moment his feelings crystallized into absolute certainty, understanding that he had not merely found someone who understood his isolation, but someone whose strength matched his own, whose courage in the face of judgment reminded him what integrity looked like, and he knew with sudden clarity that he wanted to stand beside this woman, not out of sympathy or alliance against common enemies, but because she had shown him what it meant to defend one's own worth without apology or retreat. Winter's approach announced itself through bare branches, etching themselves against leaden skies and frost that silvered the lawns each morning, and with the changing season came the inevitable summons of obligation, for Adrian as Duke of Thornfield was expected to host the winter ball that had been tradition for 3 generations, an event that would draw hundreds of guests from across the county and beyond, and the prospect filled him with a peculiar dread that had nothing to do with the logistics of such an undertaking, and everything to do with the woman who had come to occupy his every waking thought, because he understood that such a public event would force a declaration of sorts, would require him to navigate the treacherous waters between demonstrating his regard for Beatrice and exposing her to the intensified scrutiny that came with being visibly connected to a man of his position, and he found himself lying awake at night, considering possibilities and discarding them, wondering how to show her and the world that she mattered to him without overwhelming her with attention. She had not invited or creating a spectacle that would make her the subject of even more gossip than she already endured, and it was in this state of anxious deliberation that he found himself doing something unprecedented, sending a note to Beatrice requesting her counsel on matters of estate management, specifically regarding the allocation of resources for tenant improvements and the balance between traditional obligations and progressive reforms. And when she arrived at Thornfield Manor on a grey afternoon, with questions in her eyes about why he had truly summoned her, he found himself genuinely seeking her opinion, laying before her the ledgers and reports and asking what she thought. And Beatrice, who had expected perhaps another careful step in their developing connection, found herself instead engaged in serious discussion about crop rotation and drainage systems and the ethics of raising rents when harvests had been poor, and she offered observations that were both practical and compassionate, suggesting solutions he had not considered, challenging assumptions he had inherited along with his title. And Adrian listened with the focused attention he had always given her, taking notes on her suggestions, asking follow-up questions, treating her insights with the respect they deserved, and in this unexpected conversation about grain, yields, and tenant welfare, something shifted between them, because this was partnership of a different order than their morning walks and literary discussions. This was Adrian inviting her into the practical workings of his life and responsibilities, trusting her judgment on matters that would affect hundreds of people, and Beatrice felt the significance of this trust even as she maintained her composure, understanding that he was showing her not the polished public face of the Duke, but the private reality of a man trying to steward his inheritance with integrity, and their discussion expanded beyond the specific questions he had posed to encompass broader visions of what responsible nobility might look like, how those with power and privilege might use both to genuinely improve rather than merely maintain. And when she finally departed as afternoon faded toward evening, Adrian stood at his window watching her carriage disappear down the drive and realized that what had begun as attraction and developed into friendship had transformed into something far more profound, that he wanted this woman not merely beside him at dinners and in drawing rooms, but as true partner in the work of his life, that her mind and heart and courage were exactly what he needed to become the man he aspired to be, rather than simply the title he had inherited. And he understood with crystalline clarity that the coming ball was not merely social obligation, but opportunity, a chance to begin declaring publicly what had already become truth privately, that Beatrice Hartwell had become essential to him in ways that transcended social convention and rendered society's judgment irrelevant. And though he still did not know precisely how to navigate the public declaration without causing her pain, he knew now with absolute certainty that he would find a way, because a future without her partnership had become unimaginable. The night of the Thornfield Winter Ball arrived with snowfall that transformed the estate into something from a fairy tale, white drifts softening the edges of the ancient manor, while hundreds of candles blazed in every window, their light spilling golden across the pristine landscape. And carriages began arriving as dusk fell, disgorging guests in their finest silks and jewels, the cream of society gathering for an event that had been anticipated for weeks. And Beatrice sat in her own carriage as it joined the queue approaching the entrance, her hands trembling inside her gloves, despite the warmth of the heated bricks at her feet, because she understood that tonight would be different from every other ball she had endured, that Adrian's invitation had been specific and personal rather than merely conventional, but she could not predict what form that difference would take or how society would respond, and the anxiety that coiled in her chest made her briefly consider instructing her driver to turn back, to plead sudden illness and retreat to the safety of isolation, except that she had promised Adrian she would come, and she would not break that promise, even as fear whispered that she was walking into another evening of whispered judgment and careful exclusion. And when she finally entered the ballroom, after surrendering her cloak, she was immediately overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the gathering. Easily 300 guests filling the magnificent space, the combined wealth and power of the county assembled in one glittering mass, and she stood at the edge of the crowd, feeling herself shrinking into familiar invisibility, expecting to drift toward whatever corner had been designated for those who did not quite belong, when she heard Adrian's voice cutting through the general noise as he called her name, and she turned to find him moving through the crowd toward her with focused purpose, ignoring the greetings of other guests as he closed the distance between them. And when he reached her, he took her hand with a formality that was nevertheless unmistakably possessive, and asked if she would do him the very great honor of joining him for the opening dance. And Beatrice felt the entire room's attention shift toward them like a physical force, felt the weight of hundreds of eyes marking this moment, understanding its significance, because the Duke always opened his ball with the highest-ranking lady present, and there were at least a dozen women in this room whose precedence exceeded hers. Yet here he stood, requesting her hand with a certainty that brooked no refusal, and she managed to accept with a composure she did not feel, allowed him to lead her to the center of the floor as the musicians began the opening strains of a waltz. And then they were dancing, moving together with a grace born of their morning walks and quiet conversations, and Adrian held her gaze throughout, speaking quietly of how radiant she looked and how grateful he was that she had come, while around them the whispers began, speculation rippling through the assembled guests like wind through wheat, transforming from the malicious gossip she had endured for years into something different, something speculative and uncertain, because a duke did not grant such visible favor without intention, did not make such a public statement unless he meant to declare something significant. And as the dance continued, Beatrice felt something shift inside her chest, felt the familiar armor of defensive isolation beginning to crack as she recognized that Adrian was deliberately, unmistakably claiming her in front of everyone who had ever dismissed or diminished her. And when the dance ended, and he escorted her from the floor with her hand still resting on his arm, The conversations that resumed around them carried a new quality, uncertain respect, replacing casual dismissal, and Beatrice understood that everything had changed, that there would be no going back to invisible safety, that Adrian had ensured she would be seen whether she wished it or not. The days following the Thornfield ball brought a deluge of attention that Beatrice had never experienced. Invitations arriving by the dozen, calling cards accumulating on her silver tray, and everywhere she went, conversations would pause and then resume with altered tenor as people reassessed her significance in light of the Duke's unmistakable favor. And while some of this attention carried genuine warmth, much of it felt calculating, opportunistic, society adjusting its treatment of her, not because their opinion had truly changed, but because association with her now meant potential access to Thornfield and its master, and this realization settled over Beatrice like a cold fog, because she understood the difference between being valued for herself and being courted for her proximity to power, and worse than the opportunism was the emergence of a new form of gossip, whispers that questioned whether the Duke truly understood what he was doing, whether his judgment had been compromised by isolation or eccentricity, suggestions that surely a man of his position could do better than a widow of questionable reputation. And Beatrice heard these whispers even when they were not meant for her ears, caught the pitying looks from women who seemed to think she was somehow ensnaring a man above her station. And each comment, each look, each subtle intimation that she was unworthy of Adrian's regard worked like drops of acid on her fragile hope, and she began to see her reflection through society's eyes again, and began to question whether accepting his attention was selfish, whether by allowing him to publicly favor her, she was dragging him down to her level rather than being elevated to his, and the fear that had always lived in her chest, the fear that she would somehow contaminate or damage anyone who cared for her, began to grow and spread, and she found herself lying awake at night, constructing scenarios in which Adrian's reputation suffered because of her, imagining his eventual regret when he realized what his favor had cost him, and gradually, almost without conscious decision, she began to withdraw, declining invitations even when she knew he would be present, sending polite notes expressing regret due to headaches or fatigue or pressing matters at her own estate. And when Adrian sent messages requesting her company for their customary morning walks, she replied that the weather had turned too cold for her constitution, and she stopped visiting the library where they had first truly spoken, avoided the village on days when she knew he conducted business there, and she told herself this was kindness, that she was protecting him from the damage her presence would inevitably cause, that the most loving thing she could do was remove herself before his association with her created irreparable harm to his standing, and she did not allow herself to acknowledge the pain this withdrawal caused her, did not admit that every declined invitation felt like tearing away a piece of herself, because she had learned long ago to endure pain in silence, had mastered the art of sacrificing her own happiness for what she perceived as greater good, and so she retreated into the isolation that had been her refuge and prison for 3 years, telling herself it was necessary, inevitable, the only honorable choice, even as her heart whispered that she was making a terrible mistake. Adrian noticed Beatrice's withdrawal within days, recognized the familiar pattern of strategic retreat because he had employed the same tactics himself during those terrible months before he left England, when every social interaction felt like navigating a minefield and the only safety lay in absence, and he understood immediately what she was doing and why, could trace the logic of her fear because it mirrored his own past reasoning. But he refused to allow her to sacrifice herself on the altar of his reputation, refused to permit her to disappear back into isolation in some misguided attempt to protect him from association with her supposed taint. And so on a grey morning when frost still clung to the grass despite the climbing sun, he rode directly to her estate without sending advance notice, without observing the proprieties that would have given her opportunity to refuse him, and when her butler attempted to claim she was not receiving visitors, Adrian simply stated that he would wait in her drawing room until she was, his tone carrying the unmistakable authority of a duke who was accustomed to having his requirements met, and so he was shown into the elegantly appointed room where he had sat exactly twice before, both times for brief formal calls that had maintained every proper distance, and he stood at the window overlooking her gardens for nearly 20 minutes before Beatrice finally appeared. her face pale and her hands twisting together in a gesture of anxiety he had never seen from her before, and she began to apologize for keeping him waiting, to offer some excuse about being unprepared for callers, but he cut through her polite deflections with a single direct question, asking why she had been avoiding him, and the bluntness of it seemed to rob her of the careful evasions she had surely prepared, leaving her standing in the middle of her own drawing room, looking suddenly lost, and after a long moment she said quietly that she thought it best if they maintained some distance, that the attention his favor had brought her was not the kind that would serve him well, that she had heard the whispers and knew what people were saying about his judgment and his choice of companions, and Adrian felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest as he listened to her catalogue, her perceived inadequacies, heard her describe herself through the lens of society's cruelest assessments, and when she finally fell silent, he crossed the room to stand before her and said with absolute conviction that he did not care what society whispered, that he had spent years in exile because of society's whispers and had learned that their opinions held power only if he granted it to them, and Beatrice shook her head and replied that it was different for her, and that his reputation could withstand association with her, but hers would drag him down, that she could not bear to be the reason his standing suffered, and he took her hands then, felt them trembling in his grasp, and told her that the only thing he cared about was what she thought, whether she valued their connection as he did, whether she felt what he felt when they were together, and she looked up at him with tears beginning to gather in her eyes and confessed that she was terrified, that for 3 years she had been certain she would never feel anything but grief and isolation again, that he had awakened hope in her, and hope was the most dangerous thing she could allow herself, because losing it would destroy her. And Adrian understood in that moment the true depth of her fear, recognized that this was not really about protecting him at all, but about protecting herself from the devastation of caring and then being rejected. And he said gently that he could not promise her that society would ever fully accept them, could not guarantee that choosing each other would be easy or comfortable, but he could promise that he would never willingly let her go, that she had become essential to him in ways he was still discovering, and would she please stop trying to save him from a fate he had chosen deliberately and with full knowledge of its implications. Because loving her was not something he needed to be protected from, it was the first truly right decision he had made in years. The words hung between them in the quiet drawing room, and Beatrice felt something crack open inside her chest, some wall she had built so carefully around her heart beginning to crumble under the weight of his sincerity, and she realized that she had been so focused on protecting herself from potential pain that she had nearly thrown away something infinitely precious, something she had never expected to find again after those dark years of isolation. And Adrian stood before her, still holding her hands, his grey eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel truly seen for the first time in longer than she could remember, and she took a trembling breath and said that she needed to tell him something, needed him to understand that when her husband died, she had grieved, but she had also felt a terrible guilty relief because the marriage had been a cage, even if it was gilded. And in the 3 years since she had convinced herself that she was meant to be alone, that wanting more than solitude was somehow betraying the memory of a man she had never loved, and the guilt of that, the weight of pretending to mourn more deeply than she felt, had become another form of prison. And Adrian's expression softened as he listened, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on the backs of her hands, and he said quietly that he understood guilt, that he had carried his own for years, guilt over the broken engagement that had sent him fleeing England, guilt over the woman whose reputation had suffered when he refused to marry her despite the compromise, guilt over choosing his own integrity over societal expectation, even when that choice hurt someone else. And they stood there in the pale winter light filtering through her windows, two people who had been shaped by loss and judgment and the weight of others' opinions, and Beatrice felt tears spilling down her cheeks as she admitted what she had been afraid to name, even to herself, that she had been falling in love with him almost from that first conversation in the library, and that every walk they shared and every quiet moment of understanding had wound itself around her heart until she could no longer imagine her days without the possibility of seeing him, and the confession felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, and Adrian released one of her hands to cup her face, his touch infinitely gentle as he wiped away her tears with his thumb, and he said that she had given him something he thought he had lost forever, that when he returned to England he had been hollow, going through motions of duty without any expectation of joy, and she had shown him that hiding from judgment meant hiding from life itself, that the cost of safety was the loss of all possibility of genuine connection, and he had spent years in exile telling himself it was preferable to facing society's whispers. But she had made him want to be brave, had made him believe that some things were worth the risk of being seen and judged and found wanting, and Beatrice looked up at him through her tears, and saw in his face the same mixture of hope and fear that she felt in her own heart. And she understood that love was always a risk, and that choosing each other meant choosing vulnerability and uncertainty. But the alternative was the slow death of continued isolation, and she had been dying that death for 3 years, and she could not bear to return to it, and so she said yes, yes to whatever he was offering, yes to the terrifying, beautiful possibility of being loved and loving in return, yes to facing society's judgment together rather than hiding from it alone. And Adrian smiled then, truly smiled, and the transformation of his usually serious face took her breath away, and he leaned down and kissed her forehead with such tenderness that she felt something shift fundamentally in her understanding of what her life could be. And in that moment they both made a choice, deliberate and conscious, to stop protecting themselves from pain and instead reach for joy, despite all the reasons they had convinced themselves it was impossible. Adrian began his courtship with the deliberate intention of a military campaign, but one waged not with weapons but with unwavering presence, and the very next evening after their breakthrough in Beatrice's drawing room, he appeared at her door to escort her to a dinner at the Ashworth estate, arriving in his finest carriage with an expression that suggested he would brook no refusal, and when they entered the drawing room together, the assembled guests fell into a startled silence that lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable before conversation resumed with renewed vigor and significantly more speculation, and throughout the evening Adrian remained at her side with an attentiveness that could not be mistaken for mere politeness. His hand resting lightly at the small of her back as they moved through the rooms, his attention focused on her, even when others attempted to draw him into separate conversations, and when they were seated for dinner, he ensured that she was placed beside him, publicly claiming the position that had once been denied to them both. And Beatrice felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon them, assessing and judging and gossiping, but for the first time the scrutiny did not make her want to disappear, because Adrian's steady presence beside her felt like an anchor, and in the days that followed he continued this pattern with unwavering consistency, appearing at every social event she attended, and many she had not planned to attend, until he convinced her, always standing beside her, always engaging her in conversation, always making his regard unmistakably clear to anyone with eyes to see. And society reacted as society always did, with a mixture of scandal and fascination, some matrons clutching their pearls and whispering about the Duke's questionable judgment in pursuing a woman of such dubious reputation, while others began to warm to the romance of it, the notion of a powerful Duke choosing love over propriety, and Beatrice found herself navigating a strange new landscape where she was no longer universally dismissed, but instead subjected to a different kind of scrutiny, examined now not as a suspicious widow to be avoided, but as the object of ducal affection to be analyzed and assessed. And while this new attention was not entirely comfortable, it was at least preferable to invisibility, and gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, she began to notice other shifts, small kindnesses from unexpected quarters. Lady Morrison, who had once cut her directly, now offering a tentative smile across a crowded room, Mrs. Pemberton actually seeking her out for conversation about a charity project, and most surprisingly, she found allies among women she had barely known, women who had their own stories of society's harsh judgment, widows and divorcees, and women who had committed the sin of being too intelligent, or too outspoken, or simply too inconveniently themselves, and these women began to gather around her like a quiet coalition of the once condemned, drawn perhaps by Adrian's visible endorsement, but staying because they recognized in her a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to be weighed and found wanting by people who had never bothered to truly see her. And one afternoon, while taking tea with 3 such women in Lady Morrison's surprisingly warm drawing room, Beatrice realized that she was no longer eating alone at the edges of rooms, that she had somehow acquired not just Adrian's love, but also a circle of genuine friendship, and the revelation brought tears to her eyes that she blinked away quickly, overwhelmed by the understanding that healing was possible, that the isolation she had accepted as permanent was instead proving to be merely a season that could pass if one was brave enough to reach for something different. And through it all, Adrian remained constant, his courtship neither wavering nor rushing, giving her time to adjust to this new reality, while making absolutely certain that no one could doubt his intentions. Spring arrived at Thornfield Manor with an explosion of cherry blossoms and the sweet scent of wisteria climbing the stone walls. And on an evening when the setting sun painted the library windows gold, Adrian had asked Beatrice to join him there, under the pretense of selecting a book he thought she might enjoy, though when she arrived, she found him standing not among the shelves but in the center of the room where the last light pooled on the Persian carpet, and something in his expression made her pause in the doorway, her heart suddenly beating faster, because she recognized that look, had seen it building in his eyes over the weeks of their courtship. And he crossed to her and took both her hands in his and said that he needed to ask her something in this room, in this space where they had first truly seen each other, where between dusty volumes and forgotten histories they had discovered that neither of them was as alone as they had believed. And Beatrice felt tears prickling at her eyes even before he spoke the words, because she knew what was coming, and the joy of it was almost too much to contain. And Adrian said that he had spent years believing that exile was his permanent condition, that the price of maintaining his integrity was a lifetime of isolation. And then she had walked into his library with her sharp wit and her wounded eyes, and shown him that there were others who understood the weight of society's judgment, others who had been deemed unworthy by people who never bothered to look beneath the surface. And she had not needed him to rescue her because she was not weak or broken, but rather strong in ways that humbled him, and what he wanted, what he was asking if she would grant him, was not the right to save her but the privilege of standing beside her, of facing whatever judgments and whispers might come, not as her protector, but as her partner, her equal, her companion in all things. And he said that he was asking her to sit beside him not just at dinners and balls but in life itself, to be his duchess, yes, but more importantly to be his wife, his friend, his love, to build with him something that neither of them had believed possible when they were sitting alone at opposite ends of crowded tables. And Beatrice could barely see him through her tears, but she could hear the tremor in his voice that told her he was not certain of her answer, despite everything they had shared, and she realized that he was as vulnerable in this moment as she had been in her drawing room when she confessed her love, that proposing marriage meant risking rejection and pain, and the fact that he was willing to take that risk for her, with her, made her love him even more fiercely, and she said yes, with a voice that broke on the word, yes to being his duchess and his wife and his partner, yes to building a life together that honored both their strengths and their scars, yes to facing society's judgment as a united force rather than as isolated individuals, yes to love and hope and the terrifying, beautiful possibility of genuine happiness. And Adrian pulled her into his arms and held her as if she were something infinitely precious. And they stood there in the golden library light, surrounded by the books that had witnessed the beginning of their story, and Beatrice thought that if someone had told her a year ago that she would find this, would find him, would find herself capable of such joy after such long sorrow, she would not have believed it possible. But here in his embrace with the future stretching before them full of promise, she understood that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations began with the smallest gestures, with one person choosing to close the distance, to say, "I see you," to offer a seat at the table to someone who had been eating alone far too long. The wedding preparations unfolded with a curious mixture of grandeur and intimacy, for while Adrian's position demanded certain formalities, and Thornfield Manor required the appropriate displays befitting a ducal marriage, both bride and groom insisted on keeping the ceremony smaller than society expected, more personal than tradition dictated, and so the guest list was carefully curated to include only those who had shown genuine kindness rather than mere curiosity, those who had extended friendship rather than judgment. And as the weeks passed and Beatrice worked with the seamstresses on her gown, she found herself marveling at how different this preparation felt from her first wedding, that hurried arranged affair where she had been a pawn in financial negotiations, where the dress had been selected by others and the ceremony planned without her input, whereas now every decision was hers and Adrian's together, every detail chosen to reflect not what society expected, but what felt true to the love they had built in libraries and gardens and quiet conversations. And on the morning of the wedding, as she stood in her chambers at Thornfield Manor, where she had spent the previous night as tradition required, surrounded by the women who had become her friends and allies, she looked at her reflection and saw not the frightened girl who had married out of duty, nor the lonely widow who had eaten alone at countless dinners, but a woman who had survived isolation and emerged strong enough to choose love courageously. And when the time came to walk down the aisle of the small chapel on the estate grounds, she moved without hesitation, her steps steady and sure, and Adrian waited for her at the altar with an expression that made her breath catch, because she saw in his eyes not just love, but reverence, gratitude, joy, and when they spoke their vows they looked only at each other, speaking the words with such evident sincerity that several guests wept openly, and the ceremony itself was brief but beautiful, filled with genuine emotion rather than empty pageantry. And afterward, as they walked back up the aisle together, husband and wife, Beatrice felt the weight of the past 3 years finally lifting, and felt herself stepping fully into this new identity, not as the suspicious widow or the Duke's charity project, but as the Duchess of Thornfield in her own right, as Adrian's chosen partner and equal. And the wedding breakfast that followed was held in Thornfield's grand dining room, where long tables had been arranged and decorated, with spring flowers and soft candlelight. And when the guests took their seats, Beatrice found herself positioned not at some forgotten corner, but at the very center of the head table with Adrian beside her, his hand finding hers beneath the table and squeezing gently. And as she looked out at the assembled guests, at the friends who had supported them and the family members who had come to witness their union, she thought about all the dinners where she had sat alone at the far end of tables, invisible and dismissed, and the contrast was so profound that for a moment she could barely speak past the emotion in her throat. But then Adrian leaned close and whispered that he loved her, and she turned to him with a smile that held all the joy and hope and hard-won peace she had found in his arms. And throughout the celebration that followed, they remained side by side, partners in every sense, no longer two isolated souls, but two people who had chosen to face the world together, who had transformed their shared understanding of loneliness into a foundation for genuine belonging. 2 years had passed since that spring wedding, 2 years in which Beatrice had grown into her role as Duchess of Thornfield, with a grace that surprised even those who had doubted her. And on an evening in late autumn, when the first frost silvered the gardens and candlelight warmed the dining room windows, she and Adrian hosted their annual harvest dinner, a tradition they had established in their first year of marriage as a way of bringing together not just the prominent families of the county, but also those who might otherwise be overlooked, the widows and younger sons, and anyone who existed at society's margins. And as Beatrice moved through the drawing room before dinner, greeting guests and ensuring everyone felt welcome, she noticed a young woman standing alone near the windows, perhaps 20 years old, with anxious eyes and a dress that, while well made, was not quite in the current fashion, and something in the girl's posture, in the way she held herself slightly apart as if expecting rejection, reminded Beatrice so sharply of herself 3 years ago that she felt her breath catch, and she observed how other guests seemed to flow around the young woman without quite acknowledging her presence, creating that familiar, invisible barrier that Beatrice knew too well. And when dinner was announced and the guests began moving toward the dining room, Beatrice watched as the young woman followed last, her steps hesitant, and sure enough, when everyone had found their places, the girl was seated at the very end of the long table, isolated by 3 empty chairs on either side. And Beatrice felt Adrian's hand touch her elbow gently, and when she turned to look at him, she saw that he had noticed too, had seen what she had seen, and in his eyes was the same recognition and determination that had first drawn her to him. And without speaking, they moved as one away from their positions at the head of the table and walked the length of the room to where the young woman sat staring at her plate with barely concealed distress. And Beatrice said gently that there had been a mistake in the seating arrangements, that they had specifically requested this young lady's company at the center of the table, and would she do them the honor of joining them there? And the girl looked up with such shock and hope and disbelief that Beatrice had to blink back tears, because she remembered that feeling, remembered what it meant to be seen after being invisible for so long. And Adrian offered his arm to escort her while Beatrice gathered the girl's things. And as they walked together back toward the head of the table, where places were quickly rearranged to accommodate the change, Beatrice caught the eyes of several guests and saw understanding dawn on some faces, approval on others, and she knew that this gesture would be talked about, that there would be whispers and speculation. But she also knew that those whispers might reach someone else who sat alone at dinners, someone else who had been judged and dismissed, and perhaps that person would take courage from the story, would understand that isolation need not be permanent. And when they were all seated with the young woman between them, when conversation began to flow, and the girl's anxious expression gradually softened into something like cautious joy, Beatrice felt Adrian's hand find hers beneath the table and squeeze gently. And she thought about the journey that had brought them here, about all the lonely dinners and harsh judgments and moments when she had believed herself unworthy of connection, and she thought about how one person's choice to close the distance, to say "I see you," and to offer a seat beside them, had transformed not just her life but her understanding of what was possible. And now here they were extending that same grace to someone else, breaking the cycle of isolation one gesture at a time. And as the dinner progressed, and she watched the young woman begin to relax, begin to speak, and even laugh, Beatrice understood that this was how the world changed, not through grand proclamations, but through accumulated small kindnesses, through people who had known loneliness, choosing to ensure others did not suffer the same. Dear listener, perhaps you have sat at the end of the table. Perhaps you have felt the weight of others' judgment or the cold isolation of being deemed unworthy. And if so, know this: your exile need not be permanent. Your loneliness need not define you, because somewhere there is someone who will see past the whispers and the assumptions to the truth of who you are. And when that person appears, when they offer their hand or their friendship or simply a seat beside them, have the courage to accept it. Have the courage to believe that you deserve connection and belonging and love. And remember, too, that you have the power to be that person for someone else, to notice the one sitting alone and invite them into the warmth, to break the cycle of isolation through small, brave gestures of inclusion, because everyone deserves a seat at the table. Everyone deserves to be seen and valued and welcomed, and sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to say, "Sit beside me," to close the distance, to choose connection over comfort and kindness over judgment. And in those choices we build not just individual happiness, but a world where fewer people must eat alone, where fewer souls must endure the cold exile of society's rejection. So may you find the courage both to accept the hand extended to you and to extend your own hand to others. May you know the transformative power of genuine connection, and may you always remember that beneath the performances and pretenses, we are all simply seeking the same things: to be seen, to be valued, to belong. This story comes to you from Tales of Transformation, where we believe in the power of love, courage, and second chances. If this tale touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone, that their seat at the table awaits, that their story of isolation can become a story of belonging. Until we meet again, may you rest in peace, knowing that you are worthy of every kindness, every connection, every moment of joy that life offers.